but basically in the final, I'm going to ask you, you know, like, what is this, the end of history, as we're going to call it here. Let me do my screen sharing here. Like, what does this mean for the West? You know, like, what does this mean for us going into the future? And it has, you know, long-lasting implications of now that, you know, there's not a common enemy or a common rival for the West, represented in the form of communism, the Soviet Union. You know, that really divides us, that splits us, and we're kind of going through this period of history right now, right this moment in 2020, where that lack of a common foe, a common goal, a common struggle has led to deep divisions in the West, which we'll talk about a little bit today and definitely next week. I'm going to talk about Trump next week, just because we're now in this. I used to end this class with like the end of the Cold War and with like the war on terror, you know, George Bush and all that. But now we've kind of gotten to this new point in history where we've seen the rise of populism, and that's presented us with a new challenge. And I don't really know what to do. No one really knows what to do with it yet. So yeah, today I'm just going to try and, as briefly as possible, go over the end of the Cold War, why the Cold War ended, why the Soviet Union collapsed, and why communism ultimately fails as an attractive global ideology. So bear with me for a few minutes, guys. But you being here will position you invaluably for the final. So you're doing good work just being here. Okay, so Cold War. You know, we see the end game really approach in the 70s and 80s, especially in the 80s. There's three different factors that I like to hone in on when talking about the end of the Cold War. This all is like ancient history to you guys. It's even ancient history to me. I was born during the end of the Cold War in 1986. So like I don't remember any of this stuff because I was like 4 when the Soviet Union started falling apart. But nonetheless, it's important because it ushered in a new period of history for the world, really. So it's important to talk about, even though it's kind of a distant thing for us in the present. Anyway, so there's 3 different factors in the collapse of communism as represented by Eastern Europe. We still get communism in Cuba today. We still get communism in China. I mean, in Vietnam. These are supposedly communist countries, but they've really adopted a lot of market capitalism. So you can't really call them communist anymore, I don't think. But anyway, the economy crumbles in Eastern Europe. We get the ascendancy of Gorbachev as the premier of the Soviet Union, the leader who kind of ushers in the fall of the Soviet Union. And we also get the breakup of the party in Eastern Europe, the Communist Party. There's dissent all throughout. People start to leave communism in droves. So the 1980s is kind of what I'm focusing in on today because it's the decade of the culmination of these 3 factors coming together and vanquishing the dragon of authoritarian communism, at least in Eastern Europe. And these 3 factors come together most prominently in the Soviet Union, but also in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Eastern Germany and all these other communist countries, the part of what was called the Eastern Bloc of communist countries that, you know, formed the other side, the bad side of the tracks of the Iron Curtain, right? So, you know, I'm focusing on the Soviet Union because they're the flagship commie country, but the satellite, what's called the satellite countries, Poland, you know, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Eastern Germany, like those are all satellite countries of the Soviet Union, and they're all communist together. Okay, so I'll move through this pretty quick, but I'll post this on Blackboard if you want to clean up your notes later. The economy is really one of the biggest factors in the fall of communism, because even though communism purports to be this kind of self-contained economy, like it's not subject to the whims of the stock market, to bubbles and bursts, to recessions and depressions and things like that. The USSR still has an economy, and it still has to function and sort of, you know, find the resources to fund itself. And it struggles to keep up with the gargantuan economic power that is the United States. There are just a lot of costs associated with having two superpowers competing with each other. There's the arms race where, you know, one side is pouring a ton of money into developing new weapons to develop an edge over its rival in case a real war breaks out. You know, the cost of like stockpiling nuclear missiles, you know, I'm sure you've heard at some point, you know, that like Russia had enough nukes to destroy the world 12 times over. The United States had enough nukes to destroy the world 100 times over. You know, all those things cost money. And cost resources. There's the space race, you know, trying to send people to space first and to the moon and satellites, and all that is very expensive and costly. And then there's also conventional wars that both the US and the Soviets engaged in. You know, we could talk about North Korea, Vietnam, all those things. But the one that really broke the camel's back was Afghanistan. The Soviet Union made invading Afghanistan cool before it was cool. Like the US does this later in the 21st century and makes all the same mistakes that the Soviets made because we didn't learn our history, evidently. But the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1980, and all throughout the decade fought this guerrilla war against the Taliban, against the Afghanis. And this was a major sunken cost for the Soviet Union. They poured a ton of men and resources into this dark black hole of Afghanistan. So, so that sucks for the Soviets. There's other failures, really, of the communist state to really rein in its spending and to kind of control its resources. So, one of the big things about the Soviet Union is they have these collective farms, and they're trying to make sure everybody has enough food to eat, and they regulate the food supply in the Soviet state. But this leads to widespread kind of failure of look, as much as I can criticize the faults of capitalism, there is something in the free market that is just more efficient than trying to calibrate and calculate the individual needs of every single citizen in your country, right? Like sometimes it's better to just have a free market where the invisible hand sets prices and price controls and supply and demand, like the laws of supply and demand. Adam Smith was right hundreds of years ago, and he said, like, this is the most efficient form of, you know, of economics. And so consumer goods are always at a shortfall in the communist East. You know, there's never enough cars for people to get. There's never enough, you know, just sort of TVs and VCRs and you know, things that people want. And so that's a huge blow to the morale of Eastern European people. They just simply can't get the stuff that Westerners have. And then there's also the widespread environmental damage that's done by communism. This race, you know, this constant decades-long struggle to just produce and keep up with the West leads to massive environmental destruction, some of which is irreversible. Like go on Google Maps and look up the Aral Sea, which is it's like a Central Asian large lake, essentially. It used to be a sea. The picture on the left is what it was in the 1960s, and then the most recent image that I have from 2014, kind of satellite images, like because of irrigation, because of massive agricultural programs by the Soviet Union, there's an entire inland sea that almost doesn't exist anymore because so much water was drawn from it. It killed off the entire sea, and it shrunk by about 90%. Like, that's not to mention all the forests and strip mining and all the things that happen in Eastern Europe. Like, it's bad. So there is enormous economic and environmental damage done over the decades of the Soviet Union, and it's ultimately self-inflicted harm. It's just problem after problem after problem the Soviets have to deal with. Mikhail Gorbachev. So here's the second kind of factor in ending the Cold War. He's the last leader of the USSR before it crumbles, and he had two kind of he had two big ideas. The first one is called perestroika, and the second one is glasnost, or, you know, restructuring and openness. Essentially, we're trying to make the Soviet Union less oppressive. We're trying to ease up on censorship. We're trying to slowly introduce elements of the market economy into the Soviet state and other communist states. And the result of this is, you know, basically trying to fix the Soviet model of 5-year plans of communism, that, you know, the nanny state is going to give citizens everything they want and need. It's just not working. It's just not working. And there are just deep fundamental flaws that come with authoritarian communism. So these two ideas of reform, basically trying to open up Soviet culture and Soviet society and economy, basically means that they're trying to emulate the West in some ways. This leads to kind of a crisis of identity, like, oh my gosh, you know, like, oh, we're kind of admitting that the imperialist capitalists are right about some things. And this has a detrimental effect in some ways, even though there are some reforms that do work. Gorbachev also makes the crucial decision to pull Soviet troops out of Afghanistan after almost 10 years of endless occupation and fighting. The Soviets just can't get Afghanistan under control because it's Afghanistan. Like, you can't, no one has been able to subdue this place mostly because of the terrain, the hard scrabble kind of, you know, culture that Afghanis are known for. They're known for fighting very fiercely for their own sovereignty. And so the Soviets pull out of Afghanistan. This is a huge admission of failure. This is, you know, the first time the Soviets have been defeated in battle, you know, since, you know, the opening, you know, months of Stalingrad during World War II. And so that's a big blow. And maybe one of the most crucial things too is Gorbachev decides to, he adopts this like Russia first attitude, where he decides not to help prop up other regimes in the Soviet bloc. You know, as places like Yugoslavia and Eastern Germany and Poland start to drift away from communism, he decides, you know what? I don't want to have Russia has enough problems of her own, right? The Soviet Union needs to take care of itself before it can donate tanks and money and troops and supplies to, you know, stomping out the next revolution in Poland. And so this leads to kind of a domino effect where once Gorbachev starts to usher in these reforms, the other parts of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe start to dissent. Like, they start to dissent against communism. So it really starts in Poland. In the mid-'80s, really in the early 80s, but all throughout the 80s, there's the Solidarity movement that's formed, and it's a non-violent organization of protest and disobedience against the communist state. It's primarily led by like unions, like factory workers kind of banding together and forming collective bargaining groups. And this is in Poland, at least, this is the engine of change against communism. And so Poland wins a lot of independence from the Soviet Union, and once other countries in the Soviet bloc see this, they start to fall away as well. They form their own dissident groups and start to pull away from, Big Brother as represented by the Soviet Union. So, communist governments fall first in Poland and then in Hungary. Eastern Germany decides to form its own kind of separate thing away from the Soviet model. And then we get Czechoslovakia, Romania, and all that stuff. All that happens very quickly within the span of, really just a couple of years. In the late 80s, early 90s is when we see these things start to take off. The Berlin Wall is probably the biggest symbol of, communist oppression. This was built to separate the two halves of Berlin. After World War II, Berlin was split in half, just like Germany was split in half. And East Berliners were forbidden to, without special permission, make their way to West Berlin, which is, controlled by the United States and its allies. And so the Berlin Wall was erected as like a physical barrier to keep Eastern Germans from fleeing to the West. And the Berlin Wall ultimately falls I'm trying to remember the year. I embarrassingly can't remember the exact year that it gets torn down or starts to get torn down. I think it's 1990. But it's this symbol of oppression it's this physical symbol that starts to be dismantled in Berlin, and it signals the end of the Cold War. And all across Eastern Europe, you see this transition to free and fair elections, right? Like, as someone gets to go to the voting booth and vote for a party that's not the Communist Party, because there's still these sham elections that take place even under communism. There's this veneer of democracy. Like, this is what the people want. They vote for the communists every single year. No, this is ending, and now we get free and fair elections, or at least free elections. It's not always fair. We get open markets, the transition to open market capitalism. And so, we see the end of the Cold War. It doesn't go out in this bang. It goes out in this piece by piece domino transition of Eastern European countries to democratic capitalism, as represented by the West. So in the meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, right, the flagship communist country, Gorbachev's policies of glasnost and perestroika, it's kind of like opening the floodgates, right? Like, as soon as you allow some taste of, individual will, freedom, choice, people are going to demand more. And organized protests start to pick up steam in the Soviet Union, encouraged, of course, by the US and the CIA. But people on the ground in the Soviet Union are organizing and calling for elections, like free elections in the Soviet Union. You're not supposed to do that in the Soviet Union. This is the Soviet Union, man. Like, it's communism 101. Like, this is, the mothership. So while this is taking place in Russia, the more forceful dissident movements are taking place in the other parts of the Soviet Union, right? Because the Soviet Union is not just Russia, it's Ukraine and Azerbaijan and Georgia and Lithuania, Latvia, right? You can't really see this in the picture very well, but there's this political cartoon of the USSR as a ship, and all the lifeboats are leaving the mothership, and it's all, Estonia, Latvia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, all these other kind of small Soviet republics. they all declare independence from the Soviet Union. They're all like, hey, we're independent countries now. Screw the USSR. We don't have anything to do with Russia anymore. We're going to run our own countries. And the death blow, really the final nail in the coffin, is Gorbachev resigning the premiership in 1991 and seeing the USSR fall apart, and the Russian Federation takes the place of the Russian Soviet. So we get Russia again. Like, Russia is now its own thing, and it's completely separate from Ukraine, from Lithuania, from Moldova, from all these other Soviet republics. The USSR used to be one big happy family, and now it's 15 independent countries, more or less. So now we have Russia again, you know, thanks Obama. That was an old joke. I should probably take that joke out. That's outdated now. That makes me look super uncool. Sometimes I recycle the same jokes year after year, and it's not good. It's not good. I need to freshen up my material, like any stand-up comedian. All right, so what replaces communism in Eastern Europe, right? A dozen is underselling it, because there's actually more than that. But it takes a while for countries like Yugoslavia to break up, because there is still Yugoslavia in the early 90s. But Yugoslavia is now the countries of, see if I can remember most of them, Croatia, Kosovo, Serbia, of course, being the biggest one, Bosnia, Herzegovina, right? Yugoslavia breaks up into half a dozen different countries. And throughout the 90s and early 2000s, kind of the new crisis is not the Cold War anymore, it's ethnic warfare within these formerly communist countries that were held together by the iron fist of authoritarianism. Now you get a bunch of different countries, and you get ethnic cleansing and ethnic warfare happening between these small countries. So the Balkans is a flashpoint of conflict. Bill Clinton had to send in troops into Kosovo to help prevent Serbians from, slaughtering Kosovan civilians. That's something I remember. I'm old enough to remember that. But so that's a fairly recent kind of act of genocide that was that took place at the end of the Cold War. Russia, even though Russia is now its own thing and it's separate from all of its satellite countries, Russia is very unstable. It goes through a few different leaders and a few different kind of struggles as it tries to adopt some form of non-communist government. The end result of the decade-long kind of instability of Russia is we get Vladimir Putin. You guys know who this is, obviously, because he's still around. He was elected president in 1999, so he's been in power for quite a while. He's a product of the old kind of Soviet, he's a younger, communist party leader, but he was a part of the, was it the KGB or GRU? I can't remember which one, but one of the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union before it fell apart. And with his connections, he's able to forge a very powerful regime that becomes ever more authoritarian as time has gone by. So there's no such thing as free elections in Russia. Like, there's just not. There's no freedom of speech. The state still spies on you. Media outlets are very much censored by the state. There's no term limits anymore for Putin. He can stay in power for as long as he wants. He removed parts of the Russian constitution that said that he had to give power back, term limits and all that, and he has since removed those. He frequently poisons and assassinates his political rivals. So Russia is not the beacon of It's a beacon of stability, but in like the worst way possible, because it's a dictatorship. Like Russia is a dictatorship today. Putin will stay in as long as he wants or until he dies. And there's just no getting around that. Which is worrisome when you have, a Russia, again, that's a main adversary of the United States, because it's constantly undermining certain things in the West today, as you no doubt are aware of. So, what's the result of all of this? We get Russia, which is now a kind of authoritarian, oligarchical dictatorship. We get a bunch of independent countries in the East. We get the fall of communism. So what does that mean, politically speaking? What does that mean for history? What does it mean for today? Well, that means the U.S. is now the lone superpower in the world. We could talk about China, but China is nowhere near superpower status. Like it's nowhere near the clout and the power that the Soviet Union once wielded. Although it's getting there. It's getting there every year, closer to something resembling a superpower. But by far, the U.S. is far and away the most powerful country in the world. Like it's not even close. And that still holds true today. We see the triumph of liberal capitalism over authoritarian communism. Like that is a decisive victory as a result of the Cold War. Even places like China and Vietnam, like ostensibly these are communist countries. They have open markets. They have capitalism. They don't have free and fair elections. Like they're not liberal by any means, but their economies have liberalized because they have learned the lessons of the Cold War and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which is, far and away the best economic model that you could ask for on a global scale is free market enterprise. It just wins. It just does. Which isn't to say that you can't modify the free market in limited ways, but communism just simply isn't viable at this point in history. There's a lot of takes. There's a lot of hot takes in the West at the end of the Cold War. There's a lot of like victory lapping, like, yeah, America, we win. We're the best country in the world. This was always going to happen. We knew it. We're God's country. We're destined to win everything. We're number one all the time. One of the victory laps that has the most kind of interesting staying power is this book called The End of History. The End of History and the Last Man. It's written by Francis Fukuyama, who's a political scientist. He's still writing books today. He's very smart. I like him a lot. But in the early 90s, his thesis was, we've now reached the end point of history. Which sounds weird. Like that sounds ominous, like, end of days. But what he meant by this was this great struggle between authoritarian communism and democratic capitalism has proved once and for all that the best form of organizing civilization, like the best form of society, is what you see in the West. Like the West is the pinnacle of humanity's evolution as a political creature, right? Like the Cold War was the great litmus test of like, what's the best way to organize society? Is it through collective authoritarianism or more liberal means, capitalism and democracy? And the latter has decisively won. So global capitalism and democratic institutions, like those are the highest form of human social evolution. We've reached it. We've reached our pinnacle. Like that's it. That's the best form of humanity. Or at least that's the most dominant. It may not be the best, but it's at least the most inevitable, right? So by the end of history, that's what he means. The West represents this kind of final form of social evolution, much like a Pokemon evolving to its final form. We went from, classical, we went from kings and emperors to fledgling democracies, and now the world is emulating the West. Like even Russia is adopting at least democratic, quote unquote democratic elections and free market capitalism. So you can debate this, and it's very much highly debated today whether this is true, but at least there's this moment of victory in the early 90s at the end of the Cold War that said, we've done it, we've made it. The West is the best, right? There's no rival to the West. Now, I've been teaching this class for a long time at different institutions, to different groups of students, different demographics. And since I started teaching in the early 2010s, every year there's a new bullet point that I add to this slide. Like I rearranged this last part of this kind of post-Cold War thing because something new always happens to complicate this question of like, we've done it, we win forever, right? So the question is, now in the 21st century, like, are we actually destined, is the world destined to emulate the West? Is the West always going to lead? Are we destined to be a democratic capitalistic world? And this used to be like Francis Fukuyama was like unabashedly like, yes, the answer is yes to this question. But just even in the last like several years, there's been a lot of questions raised about whether this is inevitable. So for instance, there are out there in the world alternative forms of government that seem to be doing quite well. China is one of them. China is this hybrid of communism and capitalism. They are not liberal by any means. They're very much authoritarian. But they've mixed the free market economics of capitalism with the authoritarian elements of communism, and they've succeeded where Gorbachev failed. So China is doing quite well as a country, as a society, despite not being a liberal, democratic, capitalistic institution in its purest form. Also, socialism is doing quite well in certain parts of Europe. Particularly Scandinavia, they are the model. So like Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Finland, those are the Scandinavian countries. They all have this kind of mix of capitalism and socialism. So like some controls on the market for the common good, but capitalism is definitely, the way to go there. They're also doing quite well. And they've presented an alternative model to laissez-faire, hands-off, supply and demand, free market capitalism. So those are things to consider. Is that you don't have to be this purely like market-driven country to function. Also, and this is something I've really updated in the last several years, the rise of populism, the rise of rejection of the establishment in any and all forms has really taken off. And this is particularly true on the right. Right-wing populism is all around the world increasing in viability. It's increasing in its authority and power. And you see that with the elections of right-wing, far right-wing populist demagogues in Brazil. President Bolsonaro was elected just a couple years ago, and he has turned Brazil into quite a scary situation. President Duterte in the Philippines, Viktor Orban is the premier in Hungary, and all of these places are at least nominally, democracies, but they've elected far-right populist leaders that are stripping away human rights, stripping away universal rights. They're implementing their own kinds of authoritarian Christianity. Especially Hungary. Hungary is the model for this, of this kind of building an ultra-Catholic state that strips away rights from non-Catholics. And it's kind of scary because it's a rejection of universal values, individualism, pluralism, freedom of choice, things that are anathema to Western values, but it's happening in the West. Like, these are parts of the West. And we're seeing a turn towards authoritarianism and the stripping away of universal rights. In America, I'm not going to, like, we'll talk about Trump next week. And I'm trying not to make a judgment call on that. Like, I know where my place is as an instructor. It's to raise questions, not to, like, bash you over the head with certain things. But you can at least look at the rise of populist political candidates on the right and on the left, for that matter, in the United States. But there seems to be more traction and more power accumulated in the hands of right-wing political activists than there are on the left. The left is very fractured and very kind of leaderless in America, despite the rhetoric from, you know, Fox News and all that. Like, there really isn't any sort of coherent left in the United States. It's a big tent thing. It's a bunch of different things happening all at once, a bunch of different voices yelling over each other. The right is more organized, and you see and I'm talking about the far right, like what used to be the fringe 5 years ago. We're seeing the rise of neo-Nazis, of white supremacism. It's definitely making a comeback and making inroads in the United States, and that is troubling. Along with this, and probably the reason behind these things, is the internet. The Cold War, the end of the Cold War, coincides with the rise of the internet. Like, the internet really happens just a few years after the fall of the Soviet Union. But it's interesting that when the Soviet Union collapsed and we kind of won the Cold War, we saw the rise of a new global tool that allows us to sow divisions within ourselves at an alarming rate. So the internet, as a means for anybody to have a say in cultural discussions, anyone has a voice, anyone can remain anonymous and say whatever they want on the internet, that is a very powerful thing. And so with the rise of the internet, we get the rise of fake news. You know, basically we have any number of outlets empowered by the World Wide Web, where you can go on, you can say whatever you want, whether it's true or not, and you can get a ton of followers. Like, you can sway a ton of people to believing what you want them to believe by targeting their fears, by targeting their base instincts, by appealing to, you know, the not better nature, the better angels of their nature. And so we get this kind of rise of post-truth culture, where basically you can go to the internet and you can find sources or information that backs up what you want to believe. Like, you can go to a news source that will reaffirm your worldview and not challenge you at all. And that is your truth, man. That is living in your truth. And so that is troubling. And we've seen the result of that in the last several years, where, you know, there's a Rasmussen poll today where 47% of the United States likely voters believe that Joe Biden stole the election. That's almost half the country, if you can believe this one poll, and maybe you don't, and there's reasons to be skeptical. But, you know, despite there's this mountain of evidence over here for one thing, but you can reject that over here in favor of your own beliefs. And it's not just the election, it's a ton of other stuff too, the internet has ushered in this post-truth moment of history, and I don't know where that's going to take us. Like, we are in uncharted territory, friends, because you can be completely divorced from reality and just live on the internet and rant at Thanksgiving, about vaccines or whatever, and be totally affirmed by that, by a community on the internet that tells you exactly what you want to hear. And that's bad, right? We are not on the same page when it comes to reality. Like, human beings are very fractured. We are very, very polarized, and we're more separated from each other than ever. Add into that a global pandemic, and you get some really interesting things happening right now. And that's putting it mildly. So that's it. I mean, that's what I've got for you. I know it's kind of jarring and I don't know, like, a part of my job, the way I see it, is to make people aware of what's happening in the world and giving you the long game here. And then it's kind of up to you guys to decide, how to react to it. But the end of the Cold War ushers in this kind of period of the 21st century where we don't know what the hell's going on. Like, it's all the rules have been tossed out the window. With the rise of the internet and social media, it's the Wild West all over again. I don't know. I don't know, guys. It's kind of crazy. So yeah, that's what I've got. Yeah.